You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
You're listening to The Spirit Dimension with your host, Kerry Greenaway, right here on Parasearch Radio.
Good evening and welcome to the Spirit Dimension on Parasearch Radio. My name is Kerry Greenaway and as always on a Sunday evening I like to bring you a real mix of topics to discuss. We have a chat room. If you're listening, just click on the little speech bubble down the bottom and you'll access the chat room. I have got two absolutely amazing gentlemen in the studio for you tonight. We're talking a huge topic. It covers lots of different areas. So we'll do our best to cover it as best as we can. But let me first of all introduce our guests. The first gentleman is a very, very good friend of mine. He is the director of the Centre for Pagan Studies, trustee of the Doreen Valiento Foundation and Esoteric Heritage, and also an initiate high priest of the old religion, Mr. Ashley Mortimer. Good evening, Ashley. How are you?
Hi, Kerry. I'm very well indeed, thank you very much. Very well.
That's a bit of a write-up for you, isn't it?
I didn't know I was all those things. I must get busy again.
Also, alongside Mr. Ashley Mortimer, we have a Mr. Steve Ward in the studio. He is a renowned expert in the field of tarot and magical practices. He has done many speakings at festivals around the country, including the Artemis Gathering, and he is a master and close friend and confidant, of Mr. Ashley Mortimer as well. So good evening, Steve. How are you?
Good evening. I'm not sure about master of Mr. Ashley Mortimer, mind, but
I know. I sort of went. Well. I reread the same line twice. Sorry.
That's fine. I'm very well, thank you very much. And yes, this should be interesting.
Now tonight we are sort of looking because it's Easter. Everybody, happy Easter. Silence. Happy Easter. Okay, so we are talking on this Easter about how all of these various religions and that kind of correspond and overlap and interlay and incorporate all sorts of different things, which basically distills down to the life, death, resurrection cycle, and has pagan origins, doesn't it, Ashley?
Well, yeah. Well, yes, it does. I mean, everything has an origin, and what we're talking about here is that all of the religions carry narratives that appear to repeat themselves, and as you say, one of the most common ones is the life, death, rebirth cycle. So, of course, Easter at this time of year in the Western Northern Hemisphere, rather than the Western world, we're celebrating the rebirth of spring and the growth and the new shoots coming up, and of course that follows from a death cycle as well. So you've got the Christian myth, the Jesus dying, life, death, rebirth story of that going through, which is a story repeated in many other religions, some of them a lot older than Christianity, of course. So I'm thinking of things like you've got comparatives with the Egyptian gods like Osiris, Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Tammuz, and even the Greek myths of Adonis, perhaps even Dionysus, as you might call him. So you've got these these narratives that repeat themselves elsewhere, and they must interrelate. It makes sense to think that they do, because they're describing a similar kind of truth, if I may use that word slightly loosely. And then you've got the Attis myth, the Roman ones. You've got these other gods, Attis being the lover of the goddess Quabalah. And then you've got this story of her having to go and fetch him out of trouble, which is a sort of, a thing that the female of the species tends to do to the males quite a lot. And it's the same is true of the gods. Yeah, that got a snigger, didn't it? Yes. But I mean, there are other stories. There are other bits to these myths. There's the hero story and saga, and then you've got the sacrificial god. You've got vegetation god. In fact, Tammuz himself's a vegetation god, really, at heart, as is Attis. So, when people say, and people who are a little less perhaps well-versed or well-schooled in things as you, Kerry, other interviewers always say, so is it true that there's a pagan myth behind this Christian festival? The answer is that there's a myth in, there's a Mesopotamian one and a Sumerian one and probably a Roman one and an Egyptian one and a Greek one and probably a Celtic one. And which one haven't I mentioned? The Norse stories as well. All carry these narratives that keep going again and again and again. So the question is how do we tie them together? Yeah. And do that, and what do we do with that? With that knowledge that they fit in and interlink or correspond. Where do we go next with that?
It's this cross-cultural referencing that you do find on so many different levels across the globe that you can actually distill it down, and it actually is the same story, but it's just coached in a different way with different names and maybe a slightly different twist on the story, but it actually does distill down to the same story, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and and even within themselves, obviously, without wishing I don't want to appear to be a scholar or an expert on Christianity, but even within the New Testament stories, you've got the Gospels, and you've got your three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and the other, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, or whatever they were. No, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the ones that resemble each other most closely, and John who goes off. But, of course, that stems from the canonization of the Bible, of the New Testament, which, I mean, it was going on for centuries while they were deciding which bits would make it into the official version and which wouldn't. And it's a bit like recording a record or something. You take multiple takes, and you put together the multiple recordings, and hopefully you come out with the best version, and not everybody agrees. So, even within the Jesus myth and the Jesus story of the New Testament, there are differences between the different Gospels and the way that they tell them. But they're only the ones that made it into the Bible, not...
Yeah. Oh, that's very true. And we covered that on Friday quite extensively, the Bible version of Easter and its meanings and symbology and the spiritualism behind that particular brand of story. So I don't really want to go into that side of things. I want to look at more the other side of things, because there's a huge other side to this time of year and the celebrations that occur around it. And like we've talked about, the integration of one festival happens across the globe on so many different levels in regard to this time, doesn't it?
Absolutely it does. And, as you know, I've been involved on a pagan behalf in my role as a somewhat unwilling spokesman for the pagan community, as in the person who gets on the radio and the television and doesn't say something stupid. I've mixed with people of other religions and other faiths, so I've found that by representing... I don't want to say representing paganism, but I'm a practitioner of witchcraft. I'm an initiate of the craft, so I'm kind of trained in magical techniques as well as religious ones. So I've represented that with other people, and we've had this way of being able to come together and celebrate together, which is, I think, a great thing, because religion has divided humanity since humanity invented it. But there are ways of celebrating our similarities as much as there are of discussing our differences, and I've experienced that, and it's a marvellous thing. But really, even within the pagan community, and even within the witchcraft community, there are differences of opinion on things. And really, once we can dispense with the language and the jingo, the linguistics of it, we can get to where the truth is, and really everything else is just a metaphor or a story or a simile. So we can start building up these patterns of what we think is happening or what we think has happened that kind of get towards describing an underlying truth that really is defiant of language and defiant of time and culture and everything else, which is where, of course, you get these occult systems, that can tie things together. And I suppose a really good example is what we now call the Quabalah, which is terribly trendy to talk about, but
incredibly.
You know, I mean, all the film stars and the pop stars, if they're not in conspiracy theory, you know, members of the Illuminati, then they're all studying Quabalah, aren't they? And it's very popular. But really, getting at it, the Quabalah is a very useful tool that quite a number of modern pagan religions make use of in order to get to the underlying, let's call it truth. I'm not going to call it fundamental truth, but I'll just call it truth. And then you've got the things that overlay onto it. But of course, you can tell that I'm shooing in Steve, who kind of knows quite a lot more than I do about this subject. And you as well, Kerry, knowing about the tarot.
Yeah, it does all, like you say, it all overlays, which is what I find absolutely fascinating on this particular level. Now, we've touched on the fashionista side of the Quabalah, but Steve, could you give us a brief, I know it's very difficult because it's a huge topic, subject all by itself, a brief overview of what Quabalah is?
Okay, well, as you say, very large subject, and it's a tricky one to know where to start. The thing that Ashley mentioned there that's most important to notice is that, yes, a lot of the new faiths, or the newer things such as Wicca and paganism have taken quite a bit from the Quabalah, and this was because a lot of ceremonial magicians such as Will Gray, Waite and various others, Rigaldi, all tended to turn to the Quabalah for a place to start. It's one of the magical systems that you tend to see littering various paths of these various people. And you think, well, why do they use that? Why do they all turn to Quabalah? And the reason, of course, is that the Quabalistic system is one of the most complete. Other systems we have typically have bits missing, parts we don't truly know about. You know, we may know some of the myths. And the part of the Quabalah, there are many parts to the Quabalah, and there's a whole system. There's one particular piece that is of great interest, and that is the Tree of Life. The Tree of Life, in its simplistic form, is made of 10 sephiroth, or spheres, circles if you want, and they are connected by 22 paths. And this arrangement is basically pictorial. And on this arrangement, those 22 paths correspond to the 22 tarot trumps. So if you were to look online or look at a Tree of Life, you would see these paths, and you would see the tarots fit on there. Now, it's not a random arrangement. The top of the tree is what you could call the Godhead, or the ultimate sort of oneness of the universe, you know, the sort of single divine spark. And then you would have the duad that comes from that, the sort of male and female. So when we're looking at this arrangement, what we actually see is there are 3 pillars that it stands on. There are 2 on either side, Jachin and Boaz, black and white. We could sort of see them as positive and negative. We don't really think of them as as evil or good. There's no such thing as that in this. It's just simply an aspect. And then through the centre, what's called the Hermetic path. And these 3 pillars are which the tree is on. So when we look at this and we see that there's these paths leading from the very bottom, the kingdom, or where we are now, to this Godhead, we see that there's a journey. And in that journey, we have the tarot cards on these paths. And that journey is known as the Fool's Journey. And it is the journey of a person, if you want, or it's a metaphor for the journey through life. Each major arcana card stands for a stage on that journey, if you want, that person has to incorporate and realise his wholeness of it. So the very first card in the tarot, and the one that really is the place that everything starts, is the Fool. And when we look at the Fool, we see that it stands for each one of us as we begin our journey of life. And now we've got to understand what this means when we say he's a fool. He's a fool because he's a simple soul, or he's innocent of faith. He has no idea how to undertake the journey that's before him. And if we ever look at that card, we can see there's a cliff in front of him, which is obviously perilous. And if we look at that card, we see the little dog barking at his feet, and he's just completely oblivious to all this, just as people are. And we just go, yeah, I'm going to, just very much, we're going to do this, and off we go and do it. Of course, what this really means is that we're ready to embrace whatever comes our way, But we're totally oblivious to that cliff edge that we're about to cross. The fool is unaware of the hardships he will face as he ventures out to learn the lessons of the world. There is another way this would be put. Now, in some of the new pagan traditions, that would be put as, I've heard the words, "Are thou willing to suffer to learn?" Words that quite simply meaning, are you willing to, it's going to hurt. You're going to go on a journey. And if you actually think about this, that's what's going to happen. You go through life and as any mother would know, their child at some point is going to fall in love, have his heart broken. He's going to suffer. But he will learn. He will learn about love and he will go on. So it's really talking about that. It's talking about the point before any of those lessons are learned. And then the rest of the cards that follow on from that are the various lessons taking you through life and the things that you have to do, and that journey then takes you to the ultimate fulfillment in life. And that's a basic rundown of how the tarot fits onto the tree of life. Mm-hmm. Where that becomes useful to us is in all magical systems. Is not only does the tarot fit there, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet will fit on there, and various other systems. The tarot is not. The tarot is actually from a system. Sorry, not the tarot. The Quabalistic tree of life is from a system from before, but a lot of that system is missing. But it is actually knowledge that was pre-Jewish that was actually brought into this system. Now, it's made of 3 hierarchies, and this is the reason why it ends up in Wicca. It ends up in the ceremonial practices, is simply because all of this fits, and it's quite simple that there are 22 paths, and to get to that we have the elements, 4 or 5 depending on how you view that. Then you have what's called the 7 wandering gods, or the planetary hierarchy, and finally the 12 astrological signs. And those 12 plus the 7 plus the elements give you the 22, the number 22, which are the 22 paths on the tree of life. And again, that means that we could break, say, each tarot card down into saying, well, that belongs to an element, that belongs to a planet, and that belongs to an astrological symbol. And this whole thing, to make it really simple, is this. What I'm talking there is what's called symbolic language. It's all about the symbolism. So the words don't really matter. It's the symbol. And what Ash was referring to there was the symbol of death and rebirth. So taking us to Easter, the concept of death and rebirth, the point where we have to make this sacrifice and something has to come out of that. So, for example, when we're looking at Easter, he was talking about the Ishtar legend, where we look at how that works. And we have also the Sumerian goddess Inanna, who is the Babylonian name of Inanna is Ishtar, and how she has a counterpart in the pantheons known as Aphrodite or Venus. So that's the Greek and Roman. So this is all the same goddess: Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, Aphrodite, Venus, same goddess. So what the Tree of Life allowed us to do was also to use it as a filing cabinet. We could take those things and say, well, they're all the same, so they all stay in the same place. So we could put Jesus Christ and Osiris into Tifereth. The thing at the centre is the place of the sun, and you'll notice these are sun gods. Place of the sun, that's where the sun gods will be. That's where Osiris is, that's where Jesus is, that's where you place those people. And what it allows us to do, as the Tree of Life allows us to do ultimately, is glue everything together, to glue the symbolic language together so that we can make sense of what we're trying to put across when we're trying to put something across that actually spans lots and lots of systems. So, when we looked at the egg fits on the Tree of Life. The egg is, of course, the symbol of new life. The egg represents spring and fertility. Basically, it's said that Ostra healed a wounded bird she found in the woods by changing it into a hare. And basically, still partially bird, the hare showed its gratitude to the goddess by laying eggs as gifts. And that's one of the mythos from the past, which is where we get the whole idea of Easter eggs. And then Easter bunny is, again, to do with spring. So they're all linked together in that way. So yeah. I'm just going to let that go back to Ashley now, because I know he's going to have a few things to say about that. So I'm going to hand you back to Ashley now, and I'm just going to finish just there. Go on then, Ash.
Oh no, well, I was just going to say that there's a meme doing the rounds on Facebook at the moment that seems to link Ishtar directly to the name Easter, and it's not correct. It's incorrect. As Steve quite rightly says, the Easter celebrations that go on and the folklore of things like Easter eggs. He's quite right in saying that, but it's wrong to think that Ishtar is a forerunner of Easter. Easter comes from a Germanic goddess Eosta, and the Easter celebrations. Actually, it's King Alfred, the silly old fool who burnt the cakes. It's Alfred who began the idea of having holidays, and that's why we have the bank holidays here. So the Easter thing is a bit confused there, but don't get the idea that Ishtar, Inanna, Astarte and all of the Sumerian goddesses are really the names of Easter. However, their story does very much indeed fit into both the Christian life, death, rebirth cycle, and of course it sits on the tree. Because the thing I was thinking while you were talking about that, Steve, is that we've talked about the fool's journey. We've talked about this idea of mankind reaching up to achieve Godhead. But of course, the tree of life symbolises this descent journey of the God of Godhead down to manifestation. So you can get back to a creation myth as well of how God started, or the divine began as an outpouring of breath and an emanation that then comes down to physical matter. But there was one other thing that I did notice that I'm sure astute listeners will be thinking, that you talked about the correspondences of the 7 planets, the wandering gods, and the 4 elements, and then the 12 astrological symbols. But of course, if you add 7 and 12 and 4, you don't get 22, do you?
How many elements are there?
Well, that's what I was getting. That's what I was getting.
Yeah, there's obviously the 4 elements, and then spirit is also considered element.
Well, that gets 25 then, doesn't it?
Yeah,
24,
and that's and that's why, if you ever look at the Tree of Life, and I was hoping you might mention this, is where you'll often see the words BIS, which there are alternatives, and that's correct, and there has to be. And that's because some things overlap. For example, we quite commonly consider fire and Mars to have a certain overlap, and that's what you see there. But going back to what you were saying about the holidays and the observances of Easter and the egg, I mean, the egg is one of those things that is perfect, symbolises that whole promise of life. The egg is the promise of life, and if you think about it, it's a very ancient symbol, and it symbolises renewal perfectly. And this is again symbolic language. But if we wanted to do an experiment in symbolic language, and it's going back to what you said there about the descent of things and the creation or creative myths, and if we want to take some of the teachings that are around when we're looking at the Bible, say, for example. Now you think, well, I'm not talking about the Bible and pagan thing, but it's actually a very useful occult book. And the reason is this: in there, for example, we see the apple. The apple is there, and as you know, Adam eats the apple, and that causes all kinds of problems. But the apple itself, you go, well, why is this symbol of the apple? Why is this apple? And it turns up, if you look at the tarot cards, the lovers, there's an old man there handing the couple an apple. Mm-hmm. And what is this apple about? Now, most of us know if you cut an apple through the centre, you see a heart shape inside. Mm-hmm. If you cut it vertically. But most people don't know that if you cut an apple across, horizontally, you see a pentagram. Yes. And the pentagram is a very old symbol. Long before the new stuff, the ceremonial magics and things, we're talking about pentagrams having associations with the elements. It was originally nothing more than the star of Venus, or the morning star. And the morning star is literally, people noticed that the planet Venus in the sky drew every 8 years a perfect pentagram in the heavens. And that pentagram is called the Star of Venus, or Morning Star. And that star is symbolized in that apple, so you can see the apples. So what you're really talking about there is the Star of Venus, or this symbol, this very ancient symbol, in the apple one way. And the other way, it contained this symbol of the heart, which is representative of love in a way. The heart has an interesting history as to how that comes to be what it is. But the most important thing is to understand that it was this symbol of love, or again Venus. Yeah. So again, this whole idea of this apple being love and the understanding of what love was from a spiritual nature is what Eve is actually giving to Adam in the form of a symbolic language. Obviously, it gets changed into a whole story, but that's really what's going on there. And this is what we've got to realise. These symbolic actions, it's not the words themselves, it's the symbols behind them, such as the symbolic concept of resurrection. It doesn't matter who gets resurrected, just that resurrection happens, that something dies and a new thing comes. Very important, because when we look at the land right now, we look at the land and we're saying, right, there's been a lot of death and, all that over the winter. And now we're coming to the time where we need the new times to come, the new things, and the ancient people were seeing flowers coming up the ground, life returning to the earth, all these things happening. So it made sense that something had to happen to change it from this death cycle to this life cycle where life is happening. Some of them called the death bit the god, the life bit the goddess. Others created entire mythos. And all those mythos, the one, for example, when we're talking about Ishtar and Tammuz, the descent into the underworld of that, is all about this idea. She goes away, so the earth goes all dark and black and no good, and then she returns. Yeah, and the egg is, again, symbolic of promise. All of these things are all symbolic languages saying the same story. And if the story is being told the same way, many places, then it must have a significant impact on human society. And that's what these are for.
Yep. Sorry, Kerry, go ahead.
Sorry, they're like forms of teaching that spiritual cycle of life, aren't they? When you look at all these, integrated stories, when you look at the cultures, they're ways of teaching in your culture, a way of the same myths and legends come up, and I'm not explaining this very well, but they're a way of teaching that spirituality and that greater truth through stories, basically.
Yes,
with a huge symbolism behind it.
It's the symbolism of the story that's important. It's the symbolism, and that symbolism can be translated to anything. So you can say that's the land, but you could say it's a person. A person themselves has to pretty much rid the old self to make a new self. You can't. Your ideas change. Who you are as a person changes, and that change is again the fool's journey. And then that takes us right way back to the tarot cards. For the journey on the Tree of Life, we're going through that journey. And these stories are nothing more than the same as the pictures in the tarot. These are symbolic processes that you have to go through. So, for example, I don't know, pick me a tarot card. Go on, someone give me one of those, and I'll tell you what that means on the journey. Strength. Okay. So, over time, life presents the Fool with new challenges, some that cause suffering and disillusionment. But on many occasions, he has to draw on the quality of strength. Basically, you have to develop your courage and resolve to find the heart to keep going. We've all been there, that time when you think, I just can't do this. And you find in yourself that inner strength. Mm-hmm. And you discover that you are much more powerful than you thought you would. You can actually do a lot more than you thought you could. And that you actually get that exam result, you get that certificate because you had the strength to carry it through. But what he also discovers is the quiet attributes of patience and tolerance, because those are also attributes of strength. And the Fool basically realizes the willful command of, because what came before that was the Chariot, and the willful command of the Chariot has to be tempered with kindness, basically a loving approach. And that is basically what the Fool journeys through when he looks at strength, and is to learn those qualities of realizing you can get from, if you really put your mind to matters, things can be overcome. And that with patience and tolerance, you can gain willful command over the Chariot. The Chariot representing, of course, two forces that have to be harnessed together to move forward.
That's brilliant. Oh. now, baby Kerry, you can see why I was so keen to get Steve on the show.
Oh, gosh, yes. I'll be having long conversations with Stephen in private, I feel. So basically, we get to our kind of age, gentlemen, and you can see those patterns occurring throughout your own life story, can't you?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the two things that struck me there was I mean, as you and I have talked about off air quite a lot, Kerry. Somebody very very well respected by me in the craft said to me, "What do you think witchcraft is, Ashley?" And I said, "Well, that's a really big question." She went, "No, it's really simple. It's really simple. It's life. It's being able to observe your life in a way that you can see a pattern emerging, and then maybe find a way of moving through your life in a way that's more harmonious for yourself internally and for everyone else externally." So it's actually quite simplistic, and a lot of the stuff that Steve was talking about there, a lot of these symbols, it sounds terribly complicated, that there's all this hidden meaning and messages, but actually the messages themselves are actually quite simple, and we're talking about very simple concepts, and the stories reflect that too, because when you distill them down, you have a very simple thing to say, and one of those, I don't know, the theme, the life, death, birth, rebirth story is simple in itself. But then the other one that was touched on there was this descent, gods and goddesses descending into an underworld and coming back with something else. Mm-hmm. So that gets back to, I mean, it's all triangles. It's all triangles. It's that idea that you take two things, put them together and get a third. And that's life itself. That's just simply reproduction. You know, that's how it goes. You get this extra thing. So you've got lots of stories of gods and goddesses, deities, let's say, descending from the upper world to the underworld, coming back with something. And the tree of life itself, as described by Steve there, represents exactly that. You've got this descent from the top of the tree, from pure divinity, to get down to humanity, and then to return again, the human being returning again. The fool's journey is that big cycle, all the way round. So, and if you plot the journey, as we've been doing, I mean, it's worth stressing that the emphasis on the tarot is really illustrative on the tree, but you've got this journey going on through those tarot cards where you can see all of this, and the cards themselves have, exactly as Steve said, the very simple symbolism. Once you understand why the old man is giving the lovers the apple, it's a really simplistic thing. It's an apple, it's heart, it's love, and as he described rather beautifully there, I thought, the idea of the chariot going strength, that part of the journey is it the lightning flash there, Steve?
Yeah, there is. Well, the lightning flash is the journey from the top to the bottom, and that's the what they call the descent of the power, if you want, or the descent. And it is, but it was the lightning flash actually moves through the Sephiroth, the 10 spheres. But the fool's journey is the journey of the serpent, which actually moves across all the paths, and it covers all of the paths. And this is important to understand because the paths themselves are where the tarot cards, the major arcana of the tarot cards live, not in the Sephiroth. So they don't live in the spheres, the little round circles. They actually live on the paths between those round circles. Yeah, and I mean, to really tie that up, I mean, I suppose you should tie that up when we go to Easter and we look at these things, and we're talking about the sun, and Tifereth in the centre there is the sun. And this is to illustrate that difference. That Sephiroth effectively is where you would find what we call correspondence, everything that corresponds to things. So you'd find gold in there. You'd find because that's the metal of the sun, or each planet has its own metal. Then you've got things like the gemstones and things. But the things you would find in there are the various gods. And the Egyptian god would be Osiris, the Christian god would be Jesus Christ, and the various sacrifice gods would be in there. And this is the sun as a Sephiroth. But the sun as a path is a different thing. It's a path that obviously comes from Tifereth. Well, actually, it doesn't. You would think it would obviously come from Tifereth, but it does not. It actually comes from, it's between Yesod and Mercury. It's all about illusion and... Yesod is about illusion, and basically Hod is about communication. It's about Mercury. You could call this Moon and Mercury, and it's between there.
You should just point out, Steve, that these are names that you're using. These Hebrew names like Yesod and Hod. These are the names of the Sephiroth, which I would encourage any of the listeners, Kerry, to just Google for Tree of Life, and you'll see this diagram of the schematic. So you're talking about the spheres, the Sephiroths, the circle bits, as opposed to the path between.
Now, when we look at the path of the sun, what we would see there, and as I say, we're talking about Easter and the Fool's Journey and its relationship to Easter, and what we see there is the the sun brings that clarity. It directs the imagination of, when we say the fool, we mean that, obviously we're talking about ourselves taking that journey. It doesn't mean we're foolish. It means that we don't know yet until we know.
You speak for yourself, mate.
The sun's illumination, is basically, this is the light that shines on all the hidden places. Now, this is an important thing. A lot of people hear the word occult, and it's literally a Latin word, simply means hidden. And when you want to see something's hidden, you shine a light on it. You see in the tarot, there's things like the hermit, he holds a light. And and the gods of illumination and goddesses, Hecate, for example, she's a torch-bearing goddess, she's a light bringer. And the light bringer gods are basically this light that illuminates the hidden places.
Lucifer.
Yeah, Lucifer is a very classic example of a light-bringing god. And what we have there is this idea that it dispels the clouds of confusion and fear and enlightens. So the fool both feels and understands the goodness of the world. So now he enjoys a vibrant energy and enthusiasm. He's like solidified, and he's got this assurance. He's basically, and if you look at that tarot card, he's a naked babe, joyously, he's literally almost the fool again, but he's not. And he's looking at a new day, but he's got no challenges too daunting. He feels a radiant vitality, so he becomes involved in grand undertakings and draws himself into and draws to himself everything he needs to do what he needs to do, whatever his quest is. And he's able to realize his greatness. Now, think of those words and think about the sacrificial gods and and how this actually works symbolically. Someone goes along, something happens to them. In Osiris's case, gets chopped to bits, whatever. But when they get reborn, when they get recreated, put back together, they do have this point of that journey. So this journey outlined by the sun, this idea that that's where you do your grand undertaking, your magnum opus or great work. This is where you've reached that point on your journey, that point in life where you go, I have everything I need, or if I need anything to do something, I just know where to get it, and I can get this done. And that's what that's talking about. And so the sacrifice it talks about, of sacrificing your old self to bring out this new self, is the new self that actualizes what you want to do. The new self that is willful, that actually realizes its own, what it can do, understands its own greatness, and has no challenge that's too daunting. And that's what that's about. So that's the real message. So what we can see there, I hope what I've illustrated here, is that the symbolic language of these stories is both external and internal. Mm-hmm. And they do the same job, but in a different way. But that's what I'm hoping I'm illustrating there. Anyway, I'll go back to you guys.
Okay.
That's brilliant. The duality there. That's just to say that again. That's the duality. We've talked about the God, the divine descending down to physical manifestation, and then man descending back up. And there's always that other side to the coin, the hidden and the not hidden, the dark and the light. And then we've got left pillar, right pillar, yin and yang, day and night, carrot and stick, whatever you want to call it.
I wondered when that was going to go in.
I know, he had to bring it in.
But there's this duality that we're seeing there, and that's kind of an important pattern in itself. So it's patterns within patterns, and if you start simple, then it moves up from there. So you start with singularity of God, and then you spread out to this duality, and then you've got a triangle, and before you know it, you get into something more complicated. And these are fascinating kind of small patterns that are reflected in the small, in the microcosm, out into the whole. But it does just relate to life. This is our journey through life. These are just our I'm going to say something complicated like biorhythmic, but these are just patterns that we're all experiencing.
And I suppose we should also talk about whether the pagan origins of Easter, when we look at that, because there is that question: is it really a pagan thing, or? And it most definitely is, and we know this. But one of the interesting things that you notice about Easter, and again, it's one of those things that you think, when you start to look at things and you start to look behind them, how we decide when Easter is. Easter is decided on effectively a moon cycle. It is. The way that it's done is basically it's called Easter. Is basically a movable feast, as they say, and it's chosen. And the basic rules are: it's the first Sunday following the full moon after the March equinox. which is, it sounds like a lot of words, but that's how it's chosen. So, and that can be different dates. The reason it's not set a date is because Western churches use a different calendar to the Eastern churches, because Eastern churches use Julian. And so that means that the date would be different in those two traditions, but actually the same day, from our point of view. But this idea of when do we celebrate this is the first pointer to where, to the fact that this is old. And what I find interesting about this is this. It's the exact opposite of what you expect, because if you think about it, we just said this is about the sun gods, and it's all in. But actually, the actual thing that decides this is the full moon, and the moon is more often associated with the goddess, and it's the reflection of the sun. So there's a lot of other things that are taking place, and that's the first pointer to the fact that this is almost certainly a pagan festival.
Just to hit the history lesson there a bit, because what's really going on is that, I mean, a lot of people think Christianity pops up in 0 BC, obviously, but it takes a few hundred years for it to really take a grip on things. So you've got the Roman Empire gradually adopting it, which again comes from there's Roman subcults like the Mithras cult, which was a Roman soldier's cult. But there's various things that kind of get superimposed on there. But once Rome and the Roman Empire starts treating Christianity as its kind of main thing, it kind of builds from there. So even in later Anglo-Saxon Britain, you've got examples like King Raedwald in East Anglia, who's keeping 2 altars, presumably one a pagan altar to the gods of his fathers, and then a Christian altar to the gods of his sons. But it isn't till about 600 that really Christianity, that the Roman Empire starts to make use of Christianity to take over things. And there's a guy called Pope Gregory who sends out his mission to go and actually led by St. Augustine, interestingly, to go out and convert. And what he realizes, or what Augustine realizes, that he takes back to Pope Gregory is that most of these heathen, for want of a better word, or pagan if you want to call it, bits of the Roman Empire, particularly like Britain, which is a bit sullen, because it's a very British characteristic to be kind of resistant to invasion and being taken over. We're quite sullen. And he realizes that rather than just sort of impose something, it's not going to take. So he looks at they're looking at what's already going on in terms of spiritual and religious practices, and they're really just superimposing Christian festivals over that. I know I've made that sound very simplistic, and I don't mean to, because it's not. But I mean, I'll think of an example would be this time of year. We're looking at spring, fertility, and this new growth and so on. And what they're looking at is the way in which the indigenous people are celebrating this. Quite a lot of it is propitiatory sacrifice, the idea that by giving something back to the land, it will return again later. And obviously that's a cycle in the sun cycle of the year that crops up later, where you've got the sacrificial gods and you've got the John Barleycorn stuff of the harvest. But at this time of year, there are propitiatory sacrifices to local deities and divinities. So what they're saying is that the best thing we can do to placate these spirits is to have a festival and a feast. And it's much better to coerce people into continuing their existing seasonal festivals under a slightly different Christianized name. So again, the early church, even by then, they've got plenty of martyrs and they've got a bag full of saints that they could throw at any festival. So really what's going on is that they're sort of superimposing over the top of existing celebrations that's going on. So, Easter, it's a perfect time for the life, birth, death, recycle system to be kind of dropped onto that. So you've got propitiatory sacrifice. It's fairly simple that you're giving things back. So we've got giving of gifts, and of course that brings the egg in there as well, the giving of Easter eggs and the finding of them and so on, and off you go. So there's a lot of things. Actually, if I remember rightly, the Easter festival's got a lot of, especially across other parts of Europe, particularly Germanic Europe, where you've got goddesses like Iosta. Everybody wants to eat cake. Apparently cake is and biscuits is quite the thing, which makes me smile, because modern witches love cake.
Yes, we do. Just like to say.
Tell me I'm wrong.
Hashtag yes. Right, this actually brings me on to a really interesting point. We've talked a lot about symbology and the cycles of life and stuff like that. Now, whatever way you worship this time of year, there's a lot of ritual that takes place around that, isn't there?
Oh yes, I mean religion is about ritual, and this ritual acting out of things, this dramatisation of stuff. Because you see, drama, and particularly the subtle arts. I'm not going to say the subtle arts, but the unsubtle arts like poetry and music. These are great ways of expressing concepts that doesn't need language, that can defy the language. So, is that what you were getting at, Kerry?
I was sort of going more to tie into the tarot, because within the tarot you've also got that symbology regards to how we actually manifest that as a form of worship as well, as a form of ritual.
Well, I think when we look at ritual, I mean, ritual is in many things. For example, I mean, an awful lot of people will have had a family dinner today, and you know, they'd all sat down and had a big feast, and it is a feast, and you know, it is a ritual thing. The ritual use of food is the Last Supper. There's so many references to food in things where we can see, and these are rituals. You say these concepts of these rituals, and these are the smaller rituals. The idea of decorating eggs is ritual. I mean, ritualistic simply means to do something, but we have to remember that, in the wheel of the year as it's seen, and the idea that we have these festivals or feasts, and we have 8 of them, of course. I say, of course, this is only really my personal journey. So for me, there's 8 of them. I understand that they're actually 2 systems put together. One of them was the equinoxes and solstices, that was 4. And the others were all about the agricultural things. And those were necessary because these were the points in time when you needed to do certain things. For example, in Halloween, you needed to slaughter some animals, you needed to do some things to prepare for the cold times for winter. So you had to make these preparations, and there would be a ritual of doing that. When we look at getting through to May Day, we would have the ritual of basically bringing life back to the earth, you know, with the maypole and everything. And what we have there, again, is these ritual things. Now, these ritual elements were so strong that they have survived. I mean, pretty much everyone knows of May Day and Halloween. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there are 2 others, but effectively, these dates are all to celebrate certain things. May Day is, again, got a symbolic language of its own, which is about basically bringing fertility to the earth and making the earth fertile so that things will grow, because you need that coming up to the summer. This is the point when things have got to start kicking off. You've got to get things growing. You've got to get food there, because without food you die. So it was very, very important. These really were at a certain point matters of life and death. Yes. Yeah, literally. So you lived and died by these festivals.
Now that completely counterpoises with its opposite festival at Halloween, where it's storing up the food for the winter, isn't it? Once again, it's about the very simple concept of being able to shove chemicals in your body in order to survive. So both those festivals relate to food. That's why food is ritually very important, because it actually relates directly to the continuance of life.
The agricultural festivals doing exactly that. And so at Halloween, you've got to prepare the livestock. You've got to decide. You've got to keep enough to basically be able to breed for next year, but you've also got to cull a certain amount to have enough to eat through the winter to carry you through. If you get this balance wrong, it's going to be it could literally be the end of things. You're going to starve to death. And if you go too far, you won't have the things to read. So when we look at Halloween, what you actually see is a festival of death. You can actually see, there's all these things about death, and because death is literally all around at that point in time. All the farmers, everyone, that's what they're doing. They're killing things. They have to.
Which sits on the opposite spoke to life. So there's your duality, and there's your kind of counterpoint, and all the rest of it. I mean, you can keep delving into these connections and into these connected bits, but I mean, back to the Easter, back to life and Easter. We've talked about food, but even within the food, you've got stuff going on. There's a myth, isn't there, that eating. You see, the Easter bunnies, really. I mean, we're talking about sort of egg-chucking, warlike sex rabbits, really. But I mean, I think I was reading somewhere that it's the Roman historian Pliny who said that if you eat hare, or rabbit, then it will increase your sexual attractiveness. Now, again, there you go. Is somebody? I mean, there's no real supposition. There's no real kind of evidence. He's got no evidence of that. But we've got these myths that keep growing up, that keep bringing in these very simple practices. Eat something, transform it in your body into something else. Life, death, rebirth. Celebrating of the seasonal time of the year, and really, it ties into the ritual at this time of year, that you can look for these extra little bits and these little things that that tie it up. And exactly as you were saying, the symbology of the tarot, if you start looking for the symbols, they're right there. And the tarot, if you look carefully at tarot cards, and I must say, when I first started looking at the tarot, it was all about, let's find out what death really means. Mm-hmm. But you've got to look into the detail on the cards. Mm-hmm. And again, you can, I mean, Steve will tell you with a wry smile that you can pick up tarot decks that seem to have been drawn by people who have not seen the symbology or don't understand it. And you go back to something like the Rider-Waite deck, where the people who drew the cards and wrote them knew exactly what they were doing, and they specifically put those symbols in to represent these things. I've gone away off my topic, really, because what I wanted to say was that it's wrong to think that our ancestors were celebrating an 8-spoked wheel of the year with 8 festivals all nicely round out. That actually appears to be a very recent, and by recent I mean the last 50 to 100 years, invention of the modern pagan community to link these festivals together. That's not to say that our ancestors did not celebrate the festivals, but the linking together of them into an 8-spoke wheel is a much more modern construction. And there you have modern ideas, development and growth in practice, not just in practice, but in belief and how the symbolism interprets. So you can kind of keep spiralling upwards and spiralling downwards in seeing more connections, but the connections do work. I think,
one of the things there that you mentioned, I think that is very important, is to understand exactly that symbolism that you're talking about, is the rituals of that symbolism. And what we see there is the real thing here, the real message is death and rebirth. That whole cycle continues on and on. And as that happens, the symbol of that is an egg. Yeah, it's a brilliant symbol of death and rebirth, and that's why we have Easter eggs. It really is that simple in reality. As to yes, there are, and what we do as humans, we try to make meaning of things. So we put these meanings, these symbols, and the moving or using of symbols is effectively ritual. Ritual is nothing more than that. So an Easter egg hunt is literally symbolically, you could say, well, you're searching for rebirth. You're symbolically searching for rebirth. So you're creating this ritual that is to hunt this Easter egg, because to find an Easter egg is a prize.
You've got examples of even medieval Christian churches. I think there's quite a common symbol you can find in. I'm trying to think where it is. It's northwest. It's Chester or somewhere like that, where you've got a recurring symbol of three rabbits or 3 hares all running together, joined by the tips of their ears to form triangles. And we're back to triangles again. And once you break it down, you've got this very simplistic symbolism underneath. And I believe that sort of iconography is intended to be to be simple and simplistic, and it does it. But this permeates through later systems and later constructions like Christianity, and it's there if you look for it. The symbology is hidden in plain sight. The phrase that comes to mind.
But yes, to take that back and to go back to those 2 wheels. The old wheel was the equinox and solstice. We know those were celebrated in ancient times, through the way before the agricultural festivals. The agricultural festivals were a completely separate thing, and by the time they were being practiced, the practice of observing the equinoxes and solstices had long died out. And it's only, as you say, very recently that they've been put together. But this festival today is a festival of death and rebirth, and what we really have to do today is wrap it up in a way with just like an Easter egg. Although where they became made of chocolate is a whole other question.
Isn't there something to do with the ancient use of cocoa or something? There's ritual practices regarding the making of chocolate. I think the Egyptian. There's evidence that the Egyptians were drinking hot chocolate in a symbolic and ritualistic manner, and I certainly, when you get out to Mexico and places like that, you can have that. And I've been lucky enough I went to a talk. I went to a lecture that somebody gave in Nottingham a few years ago. I must dig it out and have a look for the details, because the lady talked about chocolate through the ages, which of course fantastic. But she brought examples of what she believed, or other people who got evidence for recipes. So we drank some Egyptian chocolate and we drank some Roman chocolate, and it was most interesting. So yes, you've got that. And again, you're back to making cakes. It's just a simple connection, but it's right there. So yes, the chocolate itself at Easter does have some hidden symbolism and meaning that you can trace back.
And what I thought, all this death and rebirth, the ultimate symbol of rebirth is children, and children prefer chocolate to hard-boiled eggs.
Wow! You know, in the future, our descendants will look back at the moment that the great Steve Ward uncovered this hidden truth of the universe: children, chocolate, and eggs. Yeah, I'm serious.
You know the funny thing? It's actually almost always simple in all of these things. That's the funny irony of that joke, is that quite often, as you say, these things are simple and hidden in plain sight. Yeah, they're not secret. They're right there. You just don't realise that. And once you know what an egg represents, it makes sense. And you go, oh, that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Well, if you look at an egg in 2 dimensions, if you draw one on a page, it's basically a circle that's been slightly distorted.
Mm.
So, guys, we are actually drawing to the end of the show. Thank you so much. That was the easiest show I've ever done.
I did wonder if you were still there, Kerry, actually.
No, I'm fascinated, absolutely fascinated. And I just think it just shows the importance of actually distilling it down, working out and researching the symbology that behind a lot of these concepts and things that people use. Find out why it's the symbol for that. Look at different cultures, see the origins of that symbolism, and that will actually give you a whole new level of understanding of various religions and various cultures, and things like tarot reading or Wicca work or whatever it is you do. Look at the symbology, work it out, do that research, and it really does make sense on a grander scale for people.
Absolutely. Remember, the Fool's Journey, we're all on it, every one of us. And we are making that journey, and we're learning those lessons. So it's really a quest, and we have to keep questing.
Most definitely. Thank you so much for joining me in the studio tonight. I find this whole topic absolutely fascinating. I hope you guys listening did too. A couple of notifications, I suppose is the word. We have a competition going on the Parasearch Radio group page at the moment. You've got a chance to win 2 tickets to go and visit and investigate HMP Shepton Mallet. Go over to the Parasearch Radio group page. All you have to do is comment to enter the draw. That gets drawn on Tuesday, I believe. Now, we also have our very own Penny G. Morgan running a 10k marathon, which, trust me, for her, that is a marathon. She is well happy if you want to sponsor her. Again, the link is all on the Parasearch Radio group page. Tomorrow, I will be going live on the Parasearch Radio group page to tell you all about the shows up and coming for this week, or, for the week ahead, should I say. On that note, I wish you all, however you celebrate it, a very blessed Easter. And on that note, I say thank you so much, guys. It was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us on, Kerry, and thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Steve. Even I learned something new from you, like I do every time we converse.
Mm-hmm. And vice versa.
I am so sure you guys will be back on very, very soon on Parasearch Radio, because I could sit and listen to it for hours and hours and hours. Thank you so much. If you've missed any of the shows this week, don't forget they've gone to podcast on the Spreaker app, or they're over on YouTube. If you want to listen to any of the old archived shows, we're on Podbean. We're also on SoundCloud now as well. So we're getting everywhere. Parasearch Radio is going everywhere. And on that note, guys, thank you so much, and we bid you a very farewell.
Eeyore.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.
Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.